Hey everyone, it's Dracman. I took a week off. This show's probably going to switch to be bi-weekly from now on, just as a heads up. But that's not actually why I'm doing this little intro. I'm doing this little intro because I need to give some context for this episode. So I have a good friend. We've known each other for years. He recently he lost his job, and he's been kind of down in the dumps about it. But he's a good speaker. He is very captivating, very charismatic. Um, great guy. And I figured just as a favor to him, I'd have him on the show. He's not necessarily the most knowledgeable about the kind of stuff we talk about, but I have him on because he's my pal. We go way back. So he's going to be the co-host. He might be co-hosting more often from now on, at least until he gets, something to do. But I just wanted to give some explanation for why my buddy's on this episode. I think he's going to be a good fit though. So I hope you enjoy. And welcome back to Crossfire on CNN, where we debate the political issues facing America today. I am, of course, joined by Tucker Carlson, my Republican counterpart. Say hi, Tucker.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying that I'm grateful to be here, and I want to tell you why I am here. There are two specific reasons. The first and most immediate is that during this fall's midterm elections, I got almost every single call wrong. I typically don't weigh in on races because, what do I know? I don't actually cover politics. I'm not that interested. But this time I got so spun up and so emotional that I convinced myself there was this wave coming, this political liberation that was going to happen. And I told our viewers that in some great detail and introduced a series of candidates who subsequently lost.
Great to have you here, man. Really sorry about the whole job thing, but we're going to help you out, buddy. Don't worry. For those of you who maybe don't know how me and Tucker know each other, Tucker, explain to everyone how you and I know each other.
College roommates.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's how me and Tucker became friends. Anyway, but today we're doing Crossfire because we're playing the hits. It's where Tucker got his start. It's where so for him we're gonna do Crossfire. Crossfire is also coincidentally what me and Tucker call it when we both use the same urinal at the same time in our pee streams. Cross, and we call that Crossfire. We go Crossfire, like the old game from the 90s. Anyone? Tucker, you remember that, right? You're a 90s kid, right? No? Okay. Well, anyway, so today me and Tucker are starting the beginning of Elseworlds May, which is the new month of May event I'm going to be doing here. Whether this will be a yearly thing, whether the show will still be on in a year, who knows? I might be working for Fox News by that point. But regardless, we are talking about the plan is to do 3 different Elseworlds storylines from the DC Comics world and their respective film animated counterparts, because the ones that we have planned have all been adapted or in some other way have a screen version, an animated version specifically with all 3. So I just wanted to mention that. Now, because someone listening to this might, on the off chance, not know what the Elseworlds are, Elseworlds was a how to put it? It was a line of comics that DC put out back in the day, beginning with Mike Mignola's Gotham by Gaslight, and it ran for quite a while. They did a lot of books as part of it. The way that Elseworlds worked was that it was taking DC Comics characters and reimagining them in some other environment, some other time, asking a sort of what-if question of them. Though they do tend to be different than the Marvel what-ifs, which you might be more familiar with. I don't know. Because instead of taking a moment from the DC universe and saying, what if this had happened differently, generally, due to the looser nature of DC continuity and canon, they instead often just reimagined them. They placed them in a new environment. So, Gotham by Gaslight was what if Batman existed in the turn of the century, sort of Victorian age, and was facing off against Jack the Ripper. We also had other ones like Red Sun, when Superman landed in Russia, Soviet Russia specifically, which is one of the most popular, well-known Elseworlds. There's some other ones as well that are a bit of fun. There's Superman the Dark Side, where Superman is raised by Darkseid, the DC Comics villain. There's also a lot of them are either Batman or Superman. There's very few of it about any of the other characters, but there's a few about Green Lantern too. Tucker, you're a fan of Green Lantern, right? Who's your favorite Green Lantern, Tucker?
John Stewart.
Yeah, no, he's one of my favorites too. I think from the cartoon, that's how I became acquainted with John Stewart. He's a good Lantern. We are talking about one of the lesser known ones, or at least was lesser known up until recently, which is The Doom That Came to Gotham. Now, The Doom That Came to Gotham, it should be noted, is written by Mike Mignola and Richard Pace, and illustrated by Troy Nixie and Dennis Janke. I think it's Janke. I don't know. There's a few other people who worked on it as well. It's one of those books that has quite a few credits because of colorists and inkers and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, Mignola and Richard Pace co-wrote this. Now, Mignola, besides doing the first Elseworlds book, Gotham by Gaslight, also is known to most people as the creator of Hellboy. So he's the Hellboy guy. And boy, does that come through in this book. Mignola, from what I understand, is on the record as saying he's not a big fan of Batman. I don't think he's even a particularly big DC Comics guy. But this book emerges out of a desire, I guess, by DC. From what I understand, this was commissioned from Mignola and the others as a mashup of Batman and the works of H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft, I think, is at a point where I don't really have to explain who he is to people listening. I think most people are at least vaguely familiar with H.P. Lovecraft. They know, like, Cthulhu. They know about his cat's name. Tucker, you were saying Lovecraft's cat's name earlier. A lot, actually. You were mad? You were mad at... Was he running around? You were yelling his name a lot, really angrily earlier. Anyway. Tucker's playing with a piece of lint on the couch. So, this is a mashup between Lovecraft and Batman, which is a thing that I think initially seems very peculiar. And it is very peculiar, but I think a thing about the Elseworlds is that sometimes a strange idea can ultimately lead to something interesting. One of my favorite sort of underrated Elseworlds books, and I've talked to some other people who've read it, and they would agree that it's one of the most overlooked ones, is a book called Batman Holy Terror, to be confused with Frank Miller's Holy Terror, which was also initially supposed to be a Batman book, but isn't. But Batman Holy Terror is essentially Batman as a resistance freedom fighter in a world where Oliver Cromwell succeeded in maintaining Puritan rule over England and later America, and the world has become this weird fascistic, theocratic dictatorship. That book's really interesting, but very strange as a conceit to put Batman into a world like that. I may talk about that one at some point too, though not as part of this, because I should note that all the Elseworlds I'm covering this month are going to be in some way or another related to like horror or vampires or gothic fiction, since this is the DracCast. No vampires in this book, but it is Lovecraft, and I think Lovecraft is adjacent just in that it's a classic horror thing. Well, actually, there's some vampiric themes in this. We'll get to it. A lot of bats. So, Doom That Came to Gotham was a book I've known about for a few years, always meant to read. And the thing that finally pushed me to get around to reading it was that it was adapted into one of the DC animated direct-to-video, or maybe direct to HBO Max now, I don't know, animated films. DC's been doing these for years. They've been doing them since I was a kid. I remember Superman Doomsday, I think, was the first
of the line that as we understand it now, where these are not connected to the pre-existing DC television cartoons. These are sort of just their own thing. Although sometimes they are connected. Well, that's not really relevant, but we have had some DC animated universe stuff come out of this line. And DC has recently been in the habit of adapting a lot of sort of classic storylines, but also a lot of Elseworld stuff. We had Gotham by Gaslight, we had Red Sun, and now we've had this. With those, it's worth noting that they've done, I think, generally a pretty lackluster job of adapting them. Most people have issues, I think, with elements of the Gotham by Gaslight animated film, and I think pretty well everyone agrees that the Red Sun animated film is kind of bad. They changed it in ways that didn't make it better. They managed with this one, though, I think, to make it still really good, in some ways probably better. And I think this one was an absolute sort of worthwhile adaptation to do, because most people hadn't even heard of this book. So I read this because of that, loved it, and decided I'm going to do a DracCast on it. Tucker, you read this, right?
Wrong?
Tucker, you didn't read the book? Look, man, I know you're kind of down in the dumps, but I lent you it, right? I lent you a copy. It was the one thing. Whatever, man. It's not a big deal. I don't want to beat up on Tucker too much. He's down in the dumps. He's kind of depressed because of the whole firing thing. But regardless, the Doom that came to Gotham is named specifically after, or at least inspired by, the title of one of Lovecraft's actual stories, which is the Doom that came to Sarnath. This is not really anything like the Doom that came to Sarnath. They really just picked the title because it works. Lovecraft's the Doom that came to Sarnath. And I should note as well, I am not a Lovecraft expert. I have read some H.P. Lovecraft. I haven't read even that much. I have a collection of all of his works, but I've always found it a bit daunting. So I've read a number of the major ones, and Doom that came to Sarnath actually happens to be one of the ones I have read, but it was many, many years ago. Though the Doom that came to Sarnath is notably very different than much of the rest Lovecraft's traditional work, in that it is essentially just a traditional fantasy narrative of the sort of weird fiction subgenre that you used to see a lot, like Conan and things like that. As many people know, author of Conan, Robert Howard, was in fact good friends with Lovecraft, and the two of them often made references to each other's work in their writings, and it is sort of generally accepted that in some way or another, the Conan stories and the Lovecraft mythology, the mythos, are in some way in the same universe, or there's some crossover in some way, which is pretty cool. So the Doom that came to Sarnath, just I guess as an aside, is set in the Dream Cycle, which is about an alternate dimension, like a fantasy world that you can enter through your dreams, that Lovecraft created. It's this sort of pocket realm that is in some way connected to the old ones. None of that is relevant to this. They really just picked the title because it's cool. But the Dreamlands are essentially, in the Dream Cycle, are basically just Lovecraft's weird equivalent to something like Middle-earth, in that they're generally very mythic, and it's a lot of they feel like almost fairy tale-esque. There's a couple good ones in there. The Cats of Ulthar is also a good one in that cycle that I've also read. Speaking of cats, do you guys know what H.P. Lovecraft's cat's name? No, okay, we're not doing that anymore. So some Elseworlds books, and some we'll talk about later, have a premise that I don't think needs to be in Elseworld. Batman, Dracula are very strange in that there's nothing inherently Elseworldsy about Batman fighting Dracula. You could have easily just made that an in-continuity story, but they chose to make it in Elseworlds. And this feels like a premise you could have just had be in continuity. You could have had Batman just fight the Lovecraftian horrors in the main continuity. But I think with this one, they make a good decision to make it an Elseworlds, and they really take that to its extreme, its most logical conclusion, or illogical, because nothing makes any sense. There's monsters, they exist on the edge of time and space. Human minds are being, all the traditional Lovecraft shit. I am going to, by the way, talk about both the book and the film versions of this, just as a heads up. Also, as you may notice if you listen to the last episode, that last episode was also Lovecraft related. I promise this isn't going to be a Lovecrafty podcast. I'm doing two back to back by coincidence, because I've been in that kind of mood. I've been reading some more Lovecraft stuff recently. So one thing about this is that it is ostensibly a Lovecraft pastiche, but in a lot of ways it feels like it's taking inspiration from a lot of other things as well. And I'm going to talk a bit about just the plot of this, and I think some of that will become clear. So this book very interestingly starts not in a very Batman place, but it starts in a very Lovecraft place. It's in Antarctica. And there has been this missing expedition by Professor Cobblepot. And it's gone missing, and Bruce Wayne and his assistants and crew of the ship that he's on have arrived to investigate. Now, in the comic, the crew are the three sort of Robins at the time. So Tim, Dick, and Jason. In the film version, they made an interesting decision to not use the three Robins in the traditional sense. So instead, it is Dick. And then Jason Todd, I think very cleverly, is reimagined as a young, Indian boy. And his name is Sanjay Todd, but they call him J Todd. And then they replace Tim entirely with a young, Anglo-Asian girl named Kylie Kane, who is not, from what I can tell, based on any specific DC character, which I think is an odd choice. I think she probably could have just been Carrie Kelly. She could have still been Asian and British. She could have just been Cassandra Cain, although Cassandra Cain usually doesn't talk. It's odd to me that they just invented a new character with elements of both of those characters, but at the end of the day, I liked Kylie well enough. I thought she was an interesting addition to the film, and it made it so that there was a woman in the story who isn't a villain, which is cool as well. In Antarctica, they find the remnants of this doomed expedition. This whole thing is, from what I can tell, a shout out to the Lovecraft story at the Mountains of Madness, which is also about an expedition, a disastrous expedition to Antarctica, and features these strange monsters and penguins, and note penguins, and also, the Cobblepot expedition. That's where we're going with this, and I think that that's a very creative and sort of inspired decision. So upon getting there, they find a man frozen who is this world's equivalent of a Mr. Freeze. He is not named Victor Freeze, but he is supposed to be Mr. Freeze, though he is very much combined with a character from a Lovecraft story. And this I had to look up. It's from a story called Cool Air. There's a scientist named Dr. Munoz. And the notion here is that he is dead. He is essentially undead, though, and he will decompose if he is not in the freezing cold. And so they have to actually keep him in a meat freezer so that he doesn't decompose and rot. But he still talks, and he talks about how the great ones are coming, and he's a messenger, and we're all doomed. And I mean, it's just great stuff. I love this. It feels so authentically like what Lovecraftian Mr. Freeze would be. we also see that Oswald Cobblepot has seemingly become one with the penguins. He's now naked. He's got like boils, and or I don't know if they're boils or like barnacles or something growing all over him. There's these penguins. They've got eyeballs all over them, which in the Mountains of Madness has penguins who are blind. They don't have eyes at all, from what I remember. But in this, they sort of flip that and they're covered in eyeballs because I think it's more effectively like scary from a visual standpoint. And they just lock Mr. Freeze, who again, his name isn't Mr. Freeze in this. They don't call him that, but I'm just going to call him Mr. Freeze because that's who he is. And they lock him away in this meat freezer. They head back to Gotham. In Gotham, they meet with... They get to Wayne Manor. And in Wayne Manor, there is a corpse, like Wayne Manor, of Langstrom, Kirk Langstrom. And I don't know if they call him Kirk. I think he has a different first name. But it is Langstrom. And they're like freaked out by that, but they also get an invitation to dinner from Oliver Queen. So they go to Oliver Queen's house, and this is, I think, an interesting thing here. And you can tell in a lot of ways that I don't think that Mignola and the other writers here really had much focus on keeping these characters particularly accurate to their comic book incarnations, because in the comic, when they arrive at Oliver Queen's estate, he's very different than traditional Oliver Queen. He's this very like sort of serious-ish man. He's largely just a sort of I'm Oliver Queen. I'm the heir to the fortune of the Queen family. Blah blah blah. And in the animated film, they made, I think, a pretty good decision to make him actually a little more like traditional Oliver Queen. So they get there and he's this drunk. He's drinking constantly. He's a very silly, kind of comedic, wisecracking guy, which isn't exactly Oliver Queen from the comics either, but feels closer in a lot of ways at least. And makes his story arc, I think, better than it is in the comic. But regardless, they look... Harvey Dent shows up. So Harvey Dent shows up. He's friends with these two and is running for mayor. And he puts Bruce sort of in connection to people who are in connection to Langstrom. But as this goes on, what happens is that there's this book that Langstrom had that is our equivalent of the Necronomicon. It's it's like this weird tome. It's the Book of Al Ghul. It's this. I don't know if they call it the Book of Al Ghul in the comic. I've read the comic and I watched the movie. I don't have the comic in front of me, but I read it a couple days ago, and I remember it pretty well. So there's this. Ra's al Ghul writes this tome of eldritch lore, and it is, locked away. And both Bruce Wayne and someone else arrives to get it. And the people who arrive to get it are sort of Talia al Ghul and her minions. Banana, those minions. No, it's specifically it's a version of Killer Croc, who I love. I think the Killer Croc of this is a wonderful looking take on that character, and is meant in a lot of ways to invoke like almost less a crocodile and more like an Innsmouth fish person, but is still noticeably supposed to be Killer Croc. There's really visually not that much difference between like an Innsmouth fish person and a crocodile man, so I think that they make an interesting call there. But he's very cool. They mention that this idea throughout this that the earth was once ruled by serpents and reptiles, and that these ancient lizard beings who built this great civilization that was then destroyed, which is very Lovecraftian, but is also like evocative of like the fish people from like Dagon and stuff like that. But it's also very Robert Howard, who literally created like the shape-shifting lizard man trope that we see all the time now, in like conspiracy theorists by like fucking lunatics like David Icke, and also in like D&D, the Yuan-Ti and stuff like that. Like that conceit of this ancient civilization of like lizard people who have all these crazy powers like shapeshifting and magic and stuff. That's very traditionally emerges from this the weird fiction pulp oeuvre that both Lovecraft and Howard wrote in. So that's really cool. And making Killer Croc essentially one of them is awesome. Although he's a human who gets turned into one of them, which also feels right. And Talia in this is cool. I like Talia al Ghul quite a bit in this. In the film, they have her sort of switching outfits between like this, what would be probably considered a very scandalous and revealing dress for the 1920s or whenever this. Yeah, it's the 1920s. For the 1920s when this is set, it's relatively modest in terms of things Talia al Ghul wears, but it's a femme fatale kind of look. And then she also switches into this all white, like I kept calling it like evil harem girl outfit. It's like this. She kind of looks like the Blue Lady from Batman Beyond. It's like evil belly dancer, like Arabian princess, but like evil and like sneaky and powerful. And I mean, I think it's really cool, and I actually kind of think that it would be a good like mainstream Talia look. And I want to talk also, because I mentioned her outfit, I want to mention Bruce's outfit. Bruce Wayne in this has a Batman suit that's very similar to the one from Gotham by Gaslight, which was obviously also by Mignola. It is slightly different, and I think it evokes more of a 1920s look than that did, which is supposed to be more Victorian. But it's a good design, but it's honestly like a little boring at the same time, because it's just like, yep, that's a 1920s Batman costume. It's probably cooler when it first was seen, but to me it's like, that's a good costume, but it's not particularly memorable, other than that I think it looks really cool. Tucker, who's your favorite Batman villain?
John Kerry.
I don't think Batman ever fought John Kerry. Oh no, you know what? It's in the O'Neill run. I forgot. Yeah, Denny O'Neill had them fight. I forgot about that. That's a good call, Tucker. I didn't know you ever read that stuff. That's cool. Anyway, so Talia ends up resurrecting her father through dark rituals and sorcery and all this stuff, and Ra's rises from the dead and is great. I really like Ra's and Talia in general. I think they're very cool villains for Batman, and I specifically really like them in this because so this whole book is in a lot of ways returning Batman to his pulp roots, and they already emerge from that kind of thing, and so making them the villains of this is just lovely, just wonderful. And Ra's al Ghul here is very different than traditional Ra's al Ghul. He's not like an eco-terrorist or anything like that. He's not even whatever the fuck Nolan Ra's al Ghul is, or he's not an eco-terrorist, but he's some kind of weird, like, he's like the Reapers from Mass Effect, where he's like, oh, society's gotten too strong. We need to knock it down to, like, we need to destroy it so that society can't progress. Raz's motivations in the comics and in adaptations are always sort of all over the place, but here it's just he wants to end the world because he's a servant of Yog-Sotha, which is the eldritch god. He is a disciple of Hir, who is named ostensibly after Yog-Sothoth from the Lovecraft mythos, but is seemingly also sort of different in a lot of ways. It's also worth noting that throughout this, Bruce Wayne has routinely had run-ins with Etrigan. Etrigan keeps showing up and giving Bruce Wayne these like cryptic warnings, these prophecies about how, like Bruce, in order for Gotham to be saved, it must to be destroyed. In order for Bruce Wayne to win, he must die and become the true self. Like, it's these cryptic prophecies that emerge throughout this. So Bruce is fighting Roz and Talia, and one thing I liked in the comic that wasn't in the film was there's this bit where Roz is like, and this felt straight out of like one of those pulp stories where Roz is like, Talia, you have feelings for this mortal, don't you? And she's like, Father, spare him. And that felt so just like, oh, that's great. I loved that. Anyway, Roz and Talia end up creating Poison Ivy as this like plant monster who can turn into like traditional Poison Ivy. In the film, they really expand her role, which I think is cool, and they give her this like the more monstrous form. She's more in it and does more, and I think that's cool. She's still just like basically an artificial like bioweapon that they create, and she ends up infecting Harvey Dent with Poison Ivy. And a thing that should be noted here is that Harvey Dent in this story is a good person. He, like, within the confines of this story, he's genuinely, like, he's not evil, he's not corrupt, he doesn't seem to have he flips the coin, but it's just a trick he just likes to do it. It's just a compulsive thing, and he does magic tricks with it. Harvey Dent isn't Two-Face here, except that the Poison Ivy all grows on one half of his body and starts to make him look like Two-Face. But anyway, Poison Ivy attacks Oliver Queen. Oliver Queen, it turns out, knows about all of this. He knows that there's all this stuff happening. He's fully aware of all the supernatural happenings, and he has these blessed arrows that are supposed to be the arrows that pierced Saint Sebastian, so they have the blood of the martyrs on them. And he believes that these can be used to fight the forces of Yog-Sotha, and he puts on this, it's like a medieval Templar Crusader outfit, and runs into battle, and he ends up getting killed. In the comic, he's killed pretty unceremoniously, and Batman just gets the arrows. In the film, there's a thing I think the film does better. He dies killing Poison Ivy, and the idea is that he's died fully redeeming himself of the sins of his father, because, as we learn around this time, the man who killed the Waynes was in fact Oliver Queen's father. And what it is that he, and I like this a lot because we get flashbacks to it. He'd gone insane, and he ran out with a knife and he killed Bruce Wayne's parents right in front of Bruce Wayne. And he's like screaming about like the end times and all this stuff. And Bruce didn't know who he was and ran into this building full of bats. And the notion throughout this, and I really enjoy this, is that, and they establish this, is that, so Bruce Wayne's parents and Oliver Queen's parents and the Langstroms and all these people were among the first settlers in Gotham. So they're hundreds of years old, and they were kept alive through these rituals and all this stuff. They were into the occult, but it brought this doom curse to Gotham, which is a thing we've now played with in main continuity, which I don't necessarily love in the mainstream continuity, but I think it's wonderful here. So Gotham is like inherently cursed and doomed, and that's why all this stuff's happening. And all of them had kind of gotten the buyer's remorse about it, and so the Waynes were trying to become like better people. Oliver Queen's father went insane because of like the guilt and all this stuff, and again attacked and killed the Waynes. But there's this notion that Bruce Wayne, and it's played up more in the film, but it's in the comic as well, is that Bruce Wayne is in some way chosen as like an emissary of the bats. And the bats in this seem to be depicted as the antithesis of the serpents and the reptiles and stuff, and almost like holy angelic beings, which I think is a really cool idea to do something like this. And we're back. Sorry about the brief moment of strangeness there. Tucker was He swallowed a penny from my couch, and I had to burp him, like give him the Heimlich so that he'd cough it up. He's good now, though. He's good now. Anyway, regardless, from this point forward in the story, as Bruce Wayne finally confronts Talia and Roz, well, I should note that in order to get to Talia and Roz, you get one of the best things in this entire book, which is that he goes to Harvey Dent's helm, and Dent has the side of his body that was initially just rashy and then became sort of Two-Face, has fully just grown into a portal to the weird little pocket realm thing that Talia and Roz are in. And it's a great line, and I wish because they changed it a little bit in the movie, but in the book, we get a scene of Harvey with his doctor. And he says to his doctor, who is named Dr. West, at least in the movie. I don't remember if that was his name in the comic, but it was in the movie, which is obviously a Herbert West reference. Reanimator, which, for those who don't know, Reanimator, starring Jeffrey Combs, who's also in the film adaptation of this. By the way, he plays Langstrom. That is actually based on a Lovecraft story. Regardless, his doctor says to him, well, Harv, it should clear up in a week or so. And we get a scene here where Harvey says to Bruce, as half of his body is literally a flesh portal, he says, it's poison ivy. I'm told it'll clear up in a week. And also, he begs Bruce to kill him because it is ostensibly extraordinarily painful to be a flesh portal. But Bruce is like, I gotta go through you, which is very weird. I'm aware. I'm gonna be back. When I come back, everything will be good. You don't have to worry. You won't be like in pain anymore. You can die, basically. He goes through, and he beats the fuck out of Talia, and Roz ends up defeating Talia. When he gets to Roz, Roz has merged in some way with Yog-Sotha, whether it's sort of vague as to what's happened. Yog-Sotha is both entering our reality, and also Roz is saying he is the herald of Yog-Sotha, he's the son of Yog-Sotha, and he is Yog-Sotha. And Bruce basically is like, what? And he's like, don't worry about it. It makes sense if you're me. I am all these things and none. It's a Holy Trinity thing, essentially. And he kills Bruce. But in this moment, Bruce is reborn, as the prophecy stated, and he returns as Man-Bat, essentially. He is because it's worth noting that Langstrom could commune with the bats in the same way that Bruce could, but he hadn't become Man-Bat. He just died. And Bruce has actually just become Man-Bat. And he basically says to Roz, like, cool, I'm reborn as the Batman. And it's now time for me to fucking kill you. And he kills Roz, and basically everything's good. Yog-Sotha is sort of sent back into his dimension. Etrigan shows up, and it's sort of implied that he's the one finalizing all of this battle, and Bruce can now leave and be free. Bruce leaves, and he says basically to Harvey, like, we did it, Harv, like, we saved the world, you can die now. And then we get an epilogue, and we see that Gotham, which at this point was infested with snakes and serpents and reptiles and all this stuff. There was this whole sequence about that, and parts of it, I think, were flooding as well. It has now been rebuilt. It's seemingly improving. And in the comic, Tim, who's the last surviving of the Robins, at this point, because the other two had died earlier in the story, been killed by the minions of Talia, Tim takes over Wayne Industries. And in the film version, Kylie takes over, which, as much as it's, a little bit peculiar to have a British Asian teenage girl take over a company in the 1920s. If there was in any way sort of legal paperwork of Bruce willing it to her, or even if just like the shareholder, like I don't know exactly how companies work, but I don't think there would be any like necessarily there was no law against it. It was just highly irregular, but she could have done it if through this circumstance. So again, I also this is fictional. Like it's a fake universe. It doesn't matter. You can make things a little more diverse than real life was, if you so choose to. I literally basically don't care unless it is in some way a detriment to the story, which it sometimes is, but in this case, it's not. So, who cares? Unlike some people, I really don't give a shit about that kind of thing. And at the end of this, Bruce Wayne is still alive or undead or whatever he is, and it seems as though he is sort of biding his time in case he's ever needed again, but he's still a bat. He has fully become the Batman. And I should also note that in the comic, I really like the Batman, whatever you want to call it, design. In the film, I think it's sort of lackluster. I think it's a little more generic in the film. I think it's a little less creative looking, but that's just me. And if people feel differently, that's fine. It's very minor. Another thing I should note about this that I forgot to mention, a lot happens in what is, I think, only 3 issues and a film that's relatively short. A lot happens in this series, but Barbara Gordon is in this, and she is Oracle. I don't think they call her Oracle, but she's Oracle. And she's, in the comic, she's quadriplegic and mute. And in the film, is just paraplegic and mute. But she's in a wheelchair, and she has like a weird, it's like a kind of trombone. It's the horn on a gramophone, basically built into like her and the wheelchair, and she can talk through it. And that is very Mignola. Because I don't think anything like that existed. I could be wrong at this point. Maybe something like that did exist, but that feels very much like a Mignola. Like the way in Hellboy, a lot of the Nazis have these weird, like, anachronistic, like knife arms or like the swastika goggles and stuff. That felt a lot like that, where it's like almost sort of not steampunk, because this isn't a steam era. It's like a diesel punk thing. And I have no problem with that. I think it's really cool. But she is there and basically gives Bruce some advice, and we get some character moments of her and Bruce talking, and her essentially questioning, like, why did you choose bats? And he's like, because they're scary. And she's like, that's not why. You're chosen by the bats. And I thought her inclusion it's largely irrelevant. There's a couple of things about this book and the film that I should note that I don't think need to be there. I don't think they ruin the story by any means. In fact, I like all of them as concepts, but they probably didn't have to be in here. The other big one is Etrigan. Etrigan being here sort of just muddies the mythology, because suddenly there's demons, there's hell, there's Judeo-Christian themes here, which is peculiar to put into a Lovecraft thing. That is a much more of a Mignola-esque Hellboy thing, a much more sort of modernized. Not modernized so much, but it is a thing we do with modern Lovecraft adaptations a lot. Like when we had one of the examples I think of is I watched some of Supernatural, which is a bad show, but starts pretty good. But in one of the later seasons, they do a bunch of Lovecraft stuff, and it is within the mythology that they've already established with heaven and hell. And it was really dumb, even for that show, I thought. But it is worth noting that it was, in a lot of ways, a pretty, it's cool that I don't have a problem with it inherently. I think it works better in something like Hellboy. than it does here, but I don't actually have an issue with it from like a storytelling perspective. I don't think it's necessary to this book. I think it feels like Mignola just wanted to use Etrigan, which I don't blame him for. I like Etrigan a lot. I've always liked Etrigan as a character quite a bit. I remember as a kid seeing Etrigan for the first time and thinking he was really cool. And I remember baby Etrigan from the episode Kids Stuff of Justice League, which as a child was the episode of Justice League that me and my sister watched the most when we would watch Justice League, which was very frequently. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one. This is going to be a shorter episode than normal, but there are a few things I guess I should just also note. A few Lovecraft references, a few Batman references I didn't quite mention earlier. The big ones being that I think that, well, I don't think that this is very obvious, is that Roz is combined here with the figure who in Lovecraft's mythology wrote the Necronomicon, who's known as and this is his name, is known as the Mad Arab. I know that's not a slur. It still feels weird to say, but that is the character's nickname in the series. Who is he's not the writer of the Necronomicon, he just transcribes it, but that's not relevant really. Al Ghul here is basically that character. He feels in a lot of ways though like almost more like a Conan villain in a lot of ways, because Lovecraft's villains tend to be just like monsters. They don't tend to be guys. Sometimes there are sorcerers and stuff in Lovecraft, don't get me wrong, but here he feels a lot like one of the Conan villains, one of the very Conan-esque, like one of the what are they called, the Stygians and stuff like that, or Thothamun, characters like that from Conan. And I should note, by the way, a thing that I learned recently. So I've been pretty fascinated recently with a thing that Grant Morrison chose to do in Multiversity. I swear this isn't a complete non sequitur. This is related to what I was talking to, where Morrison did essentially canon welding and combined a few different Elseworld stories into one world within the 52 multiversal structure. And the big examples to me is that Morrison combined the various steampunk, Victorian, DC, Elseworlds books into one world. And the other one being that Morrison combined a bunch of Howard Chaykin's out of continuity DC work into one universe, which I'm a huge fan of, because I specifically really like Thrill Killer, and that's also an Elseworlds I want to talk about eventually. But I was thinking, because this isn't one of the 52, but I think the 52 basically aren't a thing anymore, because we have essentially an infinite multiverse again in DC, as far as I'm aware. I've not kept up with a lot of that sort of multiversal stuff at DC. I got a little tired of multiverse stuff in general. When it's crossing the multiverse, not out of continuity stories like this. These are still my bread and butter, but I don't need them to be meeting up and crossing over all the time. Regardless, one thing I realized recently is that Gail Simone, was it Gail Simone? I don't think it was Gail Simone. My apologies. There is an official Wonder Woman Conan the Barbarian crossover, which is out of continuity and is inherently an Elseworlds thing in its very premise. And what it does that's very interesting is it places Wonder Woman within the Hyborian Age. And I was thinking that, as far as I'm aware, and I haven't read that series, you could easily canon weld that and this and have a weird fiction segment of the DC multiverse. I think that'd be brilliant. Not important. Another note I wanted to make is that this is less of a Lovecraft thing and more just a general kind of pulp thing. But Talia and Roz are always reminiscent of a very classic dynamic you see in not just Pulp Fiction, but like in not that kind of Pulp Fiction, but in general fiction in general. I think TV Tropes calls it the daddy's little villain. I almost said daddy's little monster. No, daddy's little villain trope, which is the notion of like an evil, scheming, it's often a mastermind, grand, diabolical villain, who tend to be my favorite villains, who have a beautiful daughter, who in most cases is herself evil. She's often more sympathetic than her father, but she is herself evil. Sometimes there are stories where you have a character like that and the daughter isn't evil. Flash Gordon is an example of that. Mingla Merciless's daughter is not evil, but in Talia's case, and in the case of a lot of other characters like the Mandarin or Fu Manchu, who inspired basically all of these characters, they have a young, sort of seductive femme fatale daughter who is herself a villain. And we've seen in DC Comics that Talia is capable of essentially being the villain her father is. And we've seen that, hints of that in other things too. But Morrison really took that to its full extent and made her like a true fucking powerhouse of a villain, which is brilliant. I like that a lot. But all of that harkens back really to Fu Manchu and characters like that. And there are, I can't think of specific examples, but I'm fairly certain there are villains like that in Conan stories. Though off the top of my head, I'm blanking on names or even context. I'm vaguely aware there are villains like that. And Conan stories often feature these sorts of seductive but evil, but sort of sympathetic female villains. And Talia in this is that, and in most things is that. And it's one of the reasons I think Talia is a good villain, because I think we've come around full circle, and we can admit that it's a problem when all female villains are a sexy, evil seductress, because that implies that it's women's only avenue to be evil, and it implies that sex is evil, which obviously sex isn't evil. But I think that we've also come full circle enough that we can recognize that, and also recognize that there's nothing inherently wrong with a character like that, so long as not every female character or villain is like that. Because a character like that can be interesting and be fun. And I think it's especially good in a case like Talia's, where she's also very competent. She's a very smart, intelligent person. And she is defined by her father and her father's legacy. But in a sense, he earns it. And in a sense, she is not doing it. Sometimes Talia is doing it to impress him, but other times it's just, like in this, it feels like they just have shared goals. They just both want to fucking end the world. Another thing I should note that I really liked in this, no Joker. If this story was written today, there would be a Joker. I don't mean because they didn't add a Joker to the movie, but if like the original graphic novel, it's not an OGN, but if the miniseries came out today, they would have forced them to put a Joker in this, and that wouldn't have been difficult or even impossible to do. I don't know where he would have fit in. I think that if this had somehow had a sequel, that would have maybe been where they would have gone with it, because the character of Pikmin is in a lot of ways Joker-esque. Pikmin being a not the Nintendo game, but Pikmin being a Lovecraft character who, if you want a good sort of film version of Pikmin, check out Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, because there's an episode in that where, what's his name? Crispin Glover plays Pikmin, and he basically just plays Pikmin as New England Joker. And I actually really liked that performance, even though Crispin Glover's not an actor I usually like because he's insane. But it worked there. I thought it was great. And so, yeah, that's worth noting. is that they could have done the Joker like that, but he wouldn't have fit in here, and he would have been unnecessary, and it would have felt like they were just shoving him in. So I'm happy we didn't do that. I think most of the Batman villains who would fit in something like this are here. We don't have, I don't know, Hugo Strange. He might have fit, but we don't need him. We could have had the Scarecrow. He would have maybe fit, but we don't need him. There's surprisingly little with Arkham, since Arkham is a phrase that is also used by Lovecraft. Arkham Horror, Arkham, it's used frequently in Lovecraft. The film adds a scene in Arkham, but the comic generally avoids using Arkham at all. So I think that's interesting as well. And in general, I would say that of the Elseworlds stories I've read, which is by no means all of them, but is quite a few, The Doom That Came to Gotham is one of the best I've read. It's significantly better than probably most of them. It's in the upper half, because a lot of the Elseworlds stories are quite dreadful. But it's pretty good. It's not my favorite by any means, but it's a lot of fun. And if you're like me and you're not, well, okay, I know more about Lovecraft than a lot of people, but you don't have to know as much about Lovecraft as I do, or like people who actually know about Lovecraft do, to appreciate this. If you just are vaguely familiar, maybe you just know Lovecraft stuff in general, you could probably read this. And I think that, or watch the film. Actually, I think watching the film is a completely valid alternative, because I think it's a very good adaptation. It's a better adaptation than most of these are. And just overall, I think that this is one to check out if you're interested in this premise, this story, as I've described it. I was lucky to have seen this on a shelf at a comic book store that had put it out, presumably because the film had just come out. And I was like, oh, I'll read that. And I was on a bus trip, a long fucking bus trip. And I read that, and I read Mark Millar's The Magic Order, which is not relevant to this, but I did really enjoy as well. That probably won't get a DracCast episode, but it's a rare Mark Millar W. Overall, I think that Doom That Came to Gotham is it's just one of the stronger DC Elseworlds, and despite its very odd premise, it works. I think that Batman needs to have more horror in general. I think that we've made Batman a street level vigilante crime character, and I don't think that's inherently bad. I think he can be interesting that way. I think Dark Knight Returns is good. I think that Year One is okay. I think that the Nolan movies and I think the new film have all done a good job with that, although the Nolan films are a little more heightened than street level. But I think that Batman has lost a lot of his roots as a character who had more in common with the Shadow than he does with Dirty Harry, or I don't know, whatever Charles Bronson's character's name in Death Wish is. I think we need a little less vigilante with Batman. I think we need a little bit more mystery man, if that makes any sense. A little more like guy who gets rough and tumble, because this is one of the more Solomon Kane-esque Batman things, and I think more shit like that would be pretty cool, personally. Anyway, that's all from me. Tucker, do you have any closing statements?
Castrate your children.
All right, Tucker, that's certainly interesting. Yeah. Anyway, tune in next week when me and Tucker are going to have Jon Stewart on the show, and he's going to embarrass us. Anyway, for this week, this has been Crossfire on CNN. You're watching CNN.